Hello again. We continue our Nullitaire playthrough of Liberty or Death. Once again, Nullitaire here means we're playing with 0 players. In other words, we're playing the bots against each other. I'm doing my best to run the bots according to their flowcharts, and we're just going to see how they do. And with that in mind, I actually need to make a correction from the previous episode. So what happened is that the Indians marched several war parties plus corn planter from the northwest into Quebec. And they did that according to their march priority, which said, second bullet point, if one or more villages available, march to get 3 or more war parties and 1 additional neutral or passive space with room for a village. So that's what caused them to move those war parties. And they didn't have to pay for that because they were originating from an Indian Reserve province. And then it turned out that they couldn't march anywhere else. None of their other marchable war parties moved according to the other march priority, which is the third bullet point, then to remove most rebel control, first where no active support. Well, they had more marchable war parties here in the Southwest. 4 of those war parties could have moved. And I said, well, there's nowhere for them to take away any rebel control. And so I said, okay, there's not going to be any more marching here for the Indians. But I think that was a mistake. Considering it more carefully later on, I remembered the guidelines. These are general guidelines for running all of the bots. It says, unless otherwise specified, carry out whatever actions apply to the maximum extent, such as in the most spaces or with the most pieces allowed, and only as long as needed pieces and resources are available. Normal resource costs, requirements, and procedures apply. Well, that says to me then that those movable war parties from the Southwest should have just moved also into Quebec. When the Indians marched into Quebec, they should have moved the maximum pieces possible for that, which means that these pieces here should have gone as well. That's also adjacent to Quebec. So these 4 war parties really should be up here. Okay, so we're going to move them there. That didn't make any difference. That's easy correction to make. It doesn't make any difference to gameplay. Now, the Indians actually used trade on that turn as well, and they activated a war party in the Southwest in order to do that. If I had done this correctly, there wouldn't have been an active war party there because this one was already activated at that time. So that wouldn't have been possible. However, there was an underground war party in the Northwest, so they simply would have activated that one instead. And since then, there's been a winter quarters round, so they've all gone back underground. Therefore, it made no difference to gameplay ultimately. So I'll just make that simple correction right now before we move on to the next card. So at the end of the last episode, we had a winter quarters round. So all factions are now eligible. And we're starting the spring of 1779. So there are only 2 winter quarters rounds left in the game. So the next card is Admiral d'Estaing, French fleet arrives, and the French are first eligible. Their side of the event says well-coordinated French, place 2 Continentals and 2 French regulars from available or West Indies in any one colony. And the French are going to take that. Looking at their event or command box, the third bullet point, event places available French pieces on the map. Yeah, it does. It places 2 French regulars on the map. So they're going to take the event. Now, the event simply says in any one colony. And the question in their event or command box simply says, does it place pieces on the map? Yes, it does. Well, that doesn't give us any particular priorities for selecting this colony. And as far as I can tell, there are no priorities from the French here on selecting which colony this will be. So they simply select randomly. They rolled a 2-2, which gives Philadelphia, but that's not a colony. So carrying on, they end up with Pennsylvania. Therefore, the French will take the event, and they will place 2 Continentals and 2 French regulars into Pennsylvania. That gives the rebellion control of Pennsylvania. The next available faction is the Patriots, and they can take a full command of special activity. So looking at the Patriot flow chart, Patriot resources greater than 0, yes, they are at 20. Rebel cubes plus leader greater than active royalist pieces in a space with both. Yeah, that is the case because of those cubes that were just placed in Pennsylvania. So that's a space with both rebel cubes and active royalist pieces, and the rebel cubes outnumber those active royalist pieces, 4-2. So the answer is yes. The Patriots want to battle, especially in Pennsylvania. So select all spaces where the rebel force level, if possible, including the French, plus modifiers exceeds the British force level. Well, that should say royalist force level. Plus modifiers, first with Washington, then in highest population, then where most villages, then elsewhere. Well, it turns out the only space on the board where battle is even possible here is Pennsylvania. And I've done the math on this, adding modifiers and everything, and it turns out to be 4-3. So the rebellion has 4 force level plus modifiers, and the British would have 3 force level plus modifiers. So that is a space that the Patriots will select for battle. Okay, so the force level for the rebellion is 4, counting all of the Continentals, and the French are going to pay here, so they're going to count their 2 regulars as well, so that's 4. And the defenders here, that is the British, get a force level of 2. They have 1 Tory and they have a fort there, so a force level of 2. That means that the Patriots, the rebellion here, get to roll 1 die. Their force level is 4 divided by 3, rounding down, that's 1. And the defenders don't get to roll any dice because their force level is less than or equal to 2. Okay, well, I've already rolled that, and the rebellion did extremely well. They rolled a 3. Okay, so let's look at the modifiers now of that 3. At least half attacking cubes are regulars. Yes, that's true. Half of the cubes are French regulars, so they're now at 4. At least 1 attacking side piece is underground. No. At least 1 attacking leader. No. Attacking including French with Lausanne. No. British attacking a blockaded city. No. British attacking in West Indies and at least 1 squadron is present. No. Per defending fort. Well, there is a fort there defending. So that's -1, so they're back to 3. Indians defending in an Indian reserve, no. Patriots or French defending with Washington, no. Okay, so the defenders here have a total loss of 3. And they have to remove their Tory first, and then once the Tory's gone, then the fort. The Tory counts as 1, and the fort as 2, therefore they'll have to remove both that Tory and the fort and be completely eliminated from Pennsylvania. Okay, well, let's see if they could strike a blow to the rebellion at least in this battle. So they have a 0. So the rebellion right now is a loss level of 0 because the British didn't roll any dice. So let's see, at least half defending cubes are regulars. No. At least 1 defending side piece is underground. No. At least 1 defending leader? No. British defending in a blockaded city? No. British defending in West Indies and at least 1 squadron is present? No. Per defending fort? Okay, well, there is a defending fort there, so that's a +1. So they do strike the rebellion at least a little bit. The rebellion has to suffer 1 loss, and looking at their side, the French regular has to take that loss, and that counts as 2 losses. Okay. So the British lose both the Tory and the fort, and the French lose 1 regular in this battle, and both the Patriots and the French have to pay 1 resource for this. Those pieces go to casualties. And of course, the fort is immediately placed back into available. But the cubes have to remain in timeout there. All right, we now need to consider win the day. If the loser, in this case the loser is the British, and the winner is the rebellion. If the loser removes a cube or fort and 2 or more pieces, which is the case, then shift support opposition by half the number of pieces lost by the loser. All right, well, the loser lost 2, so Pennsylvania will be shifted 1 toward active opposition. So the British lose 2 in total support. Okay, we also need to consider other parts of Win the Day that are not actually included on the handout, which is if the rebellion is the winner, which is the case, Patriots may free rally in any one eligible space, and French may move any blockades from the battle city to another city. Well, that second part doesn't come into play here, because this was not in a city, and there are no blockades anyway. But the rebellion the Patriots do get to free rally in one eligible space. For a free rally, we consider the Patriot bots' priorities for rally. The first bullet point is place a fort in each space with 4 or more Patriot units and room. Well, the Patriots don't have any forts available, so that's irrelevant. Second bullet point, then place militia first at each Patriot fort with no other rebellion pieces. Well, there is such a place, New Hampshire. Those 2 forts are sitting there with no support at all from militia, or Continentals for that matter. So Patriot Bot will use their free rally in New Hampshire, and that means they get to place 3 militia there, the forts plus the population. As part of a rally, they can also potentially replace some of those militia with regulars. The last part of rally says, if desired, replace any militia in any one space containing a fort with Continentals. So we'll see if they want to do that. Well, the third bullet point. In the Patriot Force space with the most militia of those already selected for rally, replace all militia except 1 underground with Continentals. Okay, so they will use that option to replace 2 of those militia with Continentals. The Patriots now seem to be turning the tide in this war. I mean, most of the British are off the map right now. They had done quite a bit of marching around the last campaign, and most of their pieces were caught out of supply during the winter quarters, so they were mostly removed. Okay, but we'll see what the British do to come back here. The next card is Minister Comte de Vergennes, and the British are first eligible. Their side of the event says Patriots distracted by French priorities. Patriots ineligible through the next card. Well, looking at their event or command priorities, the answer to all those questions is no, except the last one. British control 5 or more cities. Yes, they do. They control exactly 5 cities right now. The event is effective. Yeah, it would do something. And a d6 rolls a 5 or more. Well, they rolled, and they got a 5. So the answer is yes. Therefore, the British are going to take this event. That means the Patriots will be ineligible through the next card. I like to signify this by simply turning over the marker for that faction. So that way, when it's time to move the ineligible factions back to eligible, what will happen is the French will move back, but the Patriot piece will simply be turned back over, and that's it. They'll just stay there for the next card. Okay, so that's how I indicate that. Okay, so the British took the event. The Indians are up next, and they can take a full command in special activity. So let's look at the Indian bot priorities. Support plus a d6 greater than opposition. Well, support is still quite a bit higher than opposition. Not as high as it was before, but there's still a 10-point difference between the two. So the answer is yes to that. Gather would place 2 or more villages. No, Gather would only place 1 village right now. Or a d6 is less than the available war parties. Well, there are 0 available war parties, so the answer is no. a space has war party and British regulars. No, there's no space like that. Therefore, Indian bot would like to march. With underground then active war parties, without moving last war parties from any village, moving last 3 war parties where gather can place a village, or adding any rebel control. So I will mark all the pieces that can move according to those restrictions, and then we'll see where they go. So all of these war parties in Quebec can move, and Cornplanter would go with them. They need to leave behind 3 war parties because Gather could place a village there in Quebec, so they want to leave that option available. And then there's this lonely war party way down here in Florida. I think that's been there this entire game, and it's never moved. It also could move here. Okay, so those are the available movable pieces according to Indian bot's priorities. So the second bullet point: if one or more villages available, and there are, march to get 3 or more war parties in 1 additional neutral or passive space with room for a village. Well, this 1 war party down here obviously can't satisfy that. There's no place it could move that would result in 3 or more war parties in additional space. So only this group up here could satisfy this. Unfortunately, everywhere they can move, there's no room for a village. New Hampshire's a possibility, but there's no room for a village there. New York's a possibility, but there's no room for a village there. Northwest, there's no room there. Southwest, there's no room there. So there's no way for them to satisfy this desire for an additional neutral or passive space with room for a village. So they just move on to the next bullet point. Then to remove most rebel control, first where there's no active support. Well, once again, this 1 war party down here is not going to make any dent in any rebel control. So we just consider this large band of war parties up here with Cornplanter. Well, once again, there are only 2 colonies adjacent. Right, Indians can't march into Quebec City because war parties can never be in a city. And there's no rebel control there anyway. So the only 2 spaces they can march into here that would remove rebel control are New Hampshire and New York. And they do have enough to take away control from either of those spaces. Therefore, they will choose randomly between those. They rolled a 1-1, and that gets us right to the top. Quebec City, no. Okay, New York is the first to come up. Therefore, Indian bot is going to move this large group of war parties together with Cornplanter into New York to take away rebel control there. Those pieces, those war parties, had to be activated when they marched into New York. Because the march command says, if destination is rebellion-controlled colony, and moving war parties plus rebellion militia there exceed 3, activate the moving war parties. Okay, well that was a rebellion-controlled colony before they moved. So they had to activate. You know, it's apparently not possible to sneak that many war parties into a rebellion-controlled colony without being noticed. So those have been activated. Okay. We were still on this third bullet point, then to remove most rebel control, first where no active support. Well, the only other movable war party is that 1 down here in Florida, and as I said, it can't move to remove any rebel control. So that's all the Indians are going to do with march. All right, so now they look for a special command to use. They'd like to warpath, but they can't because warpath requires a space with underground war parties and rebellion pieces. And there are no spaces like that. You know, because they had to activate all those pieces, all those war parties when they came into New York, they can't warpath there. At least not this turn. Not until they find a way to get those pieces back underground. Okay, so there's no way to warpath. Therefore, they'll move on and select trade instead. So it says, if underground war parties at any village. Yeah, there are underground war parties in Southwest and Northwest. Trade in the village space with the most war parties, first requesting resources from the British. Well, like I said, they could choose either Northwest or Southwest here, and they have equal number of war parties, so they'll choose randomly between those 2 for trade. They rolled already and got a 3-2. So that's 3-2, Pennsylvania. Okay, carrying on, we get Southwest. So they will activate the war party there in the Southwest and ask the British for some resources. When the British are asked for resources, they respond according to these priorities. If Indians request trade and Indian resources are less than British resources, and they are, roll a d6. Okay, well, they rolled a d6. It came up with 2. Okay. If the roll is less than British resources, it is. Offer to transfer resources equal to half, round up the number rolled to Indian resources. Okay, so they'll offer to transfer 1. Again, that's a little silly because even if they don't choose to transfer any resources, the Indians would get 1 resource anyway. But in any case, that's the way the bot is written, so that's what we'll do. The British lose 1 resource and the Indians gain 1. The next card is Confusion Allows Slaves to Escape. Only the French are eligible this turn because the Patriots are ineligible through this card because of the British play of the last event. So the French are the only faction that'll get to act on this card. And we see the sword icon under their faction there. So they're automatically going to skip considering this event. Okay, so French resources greater than 0. Yes, they're at 15. Treaty of Alliance has been played. A d6 is less than the available French regulars. Well, there are 2 available French regulars. So the only roll that would answer a yes to that would be a 1. They rolled a 5. So the answer is no. Rebel cubes plus leader exceed British pieces in a space with both. No, there aren't any spaces. Well, there is a space with cubes plus royalist pieces. That is to say, the Indians there. But there is neither French nor British in that space. So obviously the answer no to this. Since there are no French in that space, they can't choose it for battle in the first place. And they don't want a battle because there's no British there. All right, so they're going to march. So the only priorities they have for march are lose no rebel control. So I'll select all the pieces on the board that can move according to those restrictions, and then we'll see where the French want to send them. So the French can move all of their regulars on the map. I'm not including the 2 in the West Indies, of course, with one caveat. The march command for the French says, location, any destination spaces with Patriot pieces, or any space if bringing along 1 or more Continentals. So as long as the French are accompanied by Continentals, they can move, to any space. But those 2 French regulars up in Massachusetts are not accompanied by any Continentals. So they're restricted. They can only move into a space that already contains some Patriot pieces. That's the only way they can march. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind. Okay, and by the way, New York City, they want to leave behind 1 Continental because they want to maintain control of that. And in Pennsylvania, they leave behind 1 Continental for 2 reasons. 1, they want to maintain control, and also Continentals can only move 1 for 1 with the regulars. So that piece couldn't move anyway. Okay, so those are all the pieces that can move. So let's consider where they go. Within that, march with as many French regulars and Continentals as possible to add rebel control. Okay, so they want to add rebel control. First in cities, and then it should say then in colonies, but that's, in the rule book it says that, but that's missing here. So first in cities, then in colonies, within each first to spaces with most British pieces. Okay, so we have to remember, the march command says, the procedure, move regulars to adjacent space, or if in or adjacent to a rebellion-controlled city, to another rebellion-controlled city or a province adjacent. Continentals may accompany French regulars 1 for 1. Well, now there is a rebellion-controlled city, New York City. And, there are French regulars there. But there's no other rebellion-controlled city. So still, this kind of quick march through the cities option is off the table for the French. because it says if in or adjacent to a rebellion-controlled city, to another rebellion-controlled city or province adjacent. All right, so even though they do control one city, that's not really enough for that quick march option. So the only option here is to move regulars to an adjacent space, and Continentals can accompany one for one. All right, so by their priorities, they'd like to march into a city to add rebel control if they can. But they actually can't do this. There are only 2 cities not already at rebel control where they could march. So they could march from Pennsylvania into Philadelphia, but that obviously would not add rebel control because they wouldn't have enough cubes there. And they can't march into Boston, first of all, because they can't march those 2 regulars into a space that doesn't already have any Patriot pieces. That's a restriction. In any case, even if they could, that wouldn't add rebel control. Okay. So they're not going to be able to march into a city to add rebel control. So instead, they're going to choose a colony to add rebel control. There are a couple options here. New York is a clear option. They could march in, well, they could march in everything into New York and take control of that space. New Jersey's an option. Maryland, Delaware is an option. And that's it. Okay, again, they can't march into Connecticut, Rhode Island with those 2 regulars there in Massachusetts because there are no Patriot pieces already there. And in any case, that wouldn't take control anyhow. All right, so those are the 3 options. New York Colony, New Jersey, and Maryland, Delaware are all possibilities for marching here. And we're not given any way to distinguish between those 3. It says to prioritize spaces with most British pieces, but there are no British pieces in any of those spaces. All right, so they just chose randomly from those 3. They rolled a 1-3. That gives North Carolina, but following it down, we go all the way back around, and we get to New York Colony. Okay, so the French are going to march into New York, bringing along the maximum number of Continentals possible. And remembering the guidelines, right? The guidelines for all the bots tell us to, move the maximum pieces possible for each priority here. So they're going to move everything they got into New York, I guess as a response to those Indians coming into New York Colony. So every movable piece will now march into New York. So the Patriots once again take control of New York. There are no other movable pieces for the French here, so they're done with their march command. So they'd like to choose a special activity. They'd like to skirmish, but skirmish requires a space with French regulars and British pieces. You can't skirmish against the Indians. Okay, so all the French pieces are in New York and in the West Indies, and there are no British pieces there. So skirmish is not a possibility. So préparer la guerre would be next. But there are 2 parts to préparer la guerre. One is moving pieces from unavailable to available, but they don't have any unavailable pieces. Everything's available for them. The other half is adding 2 resources. So that's the other possibility with this special activity. But according to their priorities, they don't want to do that unless they're at 0 resources. And they're not. They have a lot of resources. They're at 14. So they're not going to do that either. They're going to use naval pressure instead. Add 1 blockade, first in a city selected for battle, then at most support. Well, we didn't select any cities for battle, so they're going to go for most support. Therefore, they're going to move F and I up 1 level and move a French squadron from the West Indies into one of the cities. And they want to choose the city with the most support. Well, it turns out that there's a tie here. There's two total support in Quebec City, same in Boston, same in Norfolk, same in Charlestown, same in Savannah. So they chose randomly from among those. They rolled a 1-1, which is Quebec City. So they're going to blockade Quebec City by moving one of their French squadrons up to Quebec City. Once again, that means that support is no longer being counted for total support, so I put the blockade right on top of it. And that brings total support down to 22. Okay, so once again, the French are the only ones who get to act this turn because they're the only ones eligible. So on to the next card. We have 3 eligible factions this turn. And it looks like the British are going to get paid back for forcing the Patriots to miss a turn because they're last on this card. So probably they're going to end up missing a turn too because of that. So that's karma for you, I guess. All right, well, the next card is Wyoming Massacre. And the Indians are first eligible. Their side of the event says Indians intimidate on the frontier. Shift up to 3 colonies adjacent to an Indian Reserve province, 1 level toward neutral. Place 1 raid marker in each. Looking at Indian Bot's event or command box, they might have been interested in this event by the first bullet point, because the event does shift support opposition in Royalist favor. There are spaces adjacent to Indian Reserve provinces that are at opposition, so the event would do that. But the first part, the condition on that bullet point, opposition greater than support, is not true. Support is still greater than opposition, so that's a no. The last bullet point also came into effect here because the event is effective. There are 4 more villages on the map. Okay, so they had to roll on that, but they rolled a 1. So the answer to that last bullet point is also no. So they're going to carry on with their flow chart. Support plus a D6 is greater than opposition. Yes, support is still more than 6 greater than opposition. It's coming down, but it's still more than 6. So the answer is yes, no matter what the roll is. Gather would place 2 or more villages. No. Gather right now would place a village up in Quebec, but nowhere else. So Gather would only place 1 village right now. Or a D6 is less than the available war parties. Well, there are no available war parties right now. So the answer is no. A space has war party and British regulars. No, there's no space like that. So the Indians would like to march again. And so once again, I'll mark all the pieces that can march, and then we'll see where they want to go. It says march with underground and active war parties without moving last war party from any village, moving last 3 war parties where gathered in place of village, or adding any rebel control. So the movable war parties are the group with Corn Planter in New York, and once again that lonely war party down in Florida. Every other war party has to stay where they are. Okay, so let's see where they go now. Second bullet point, if 1 or more villages available, march to get 3 or more war parties in 1 additional neutral or passive space with room for a village. Well, clearly this one down here in Florida is not going to be able to accomplish that. But this group with Corn Planter can. So there are several adjacent spaces they could move into, but only 2 that satisfy the requirements of a neutral or passive space with room for a village. So they can't move into Connecticut, Rhode Island, because that's active. They can't move into, but there is room for a village, but it's active. They can't move into Massachusetts or New Hampshire because they're active and there's no room for a village. They can't move into Northwest because there's no room. They can't move into Quebec because that's not an additional space with room for a village. There's already 3 war parties there. So the only 2 options are Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So Pennsylvania is passive and New Jersey is neutral. There's room for villages there. So one of those 2 spaces they'll select here for March. So they rolled randomly. Well, they didn't roll randomly, but they rolled in order to choose a random space. They rolled a 1-3. So 1-3, North Carolina, we have to follow it down and back around, and we eventually get to New Jersey. All right, so Indian Bot is going to move that big band of war parties from New York into New Jersey. Because those war parties originated from a colony rather than from an Indian reserve, the Indians have to pay a resource for that, which they did. Okay, let's see if there's any more march to happen here. the third bullet point now, then to remove most rebel control, first where no active support. Well, once again, the only war party that's still available for march is this one down here in Florida, and clearly it can't accomplish removing any rebel control from there. So that's all the marching that the Indians are going to do. So moving on to a special activity, they'd like to warpath, but once again, they can't because there are no spaces with underground war parties and rebellion pieces. So there's no place to warpath. So they would trade instead. So trade in the village space with the most war parties, first requesting resources from the British. Well, there's only one space where they can activate an underground war party at a village, and that's the Northwest. So they'll activate that war party and ask for resources from the British. So the British have to roll because the Indians do have fewer resources than them, and they've now been asked for trade. So the British rolled a 2. Okay, so once again, they, in a rather silly manner, reduce their resources by 1 and give that resource to the Indians, even though they could have just said 0 and the Indians would have got a resource anyway. Whatever, that's the way it goes. So British lose 1 resource, the Indians gain 1. The next eligible faction can either take the event or a limited command. And the next eligible faction is the Patriots. So their side of the event says Patriot Backlash. Remove 4 war parties in or adjacent to Pennsylvania. Well, there are a good number of war parties adjacent to Pennsylvania. Those war parties that just moved to New Jersey. But the Patriots are actually not going to take this. Only the last bullet point here was possible. Event is effective, yes. Patriots have 25 or more pieces on the map. Well, they don't. They only have 20 pieces on the map. All right, so they elect not to take that event. So instead, they're going to do a limited command. So let's see what it is. Patriot resources greater than 0, yes, they are at 18. Rebel cubes plus leader greater than active royalist pieces in a space with both. No, there are no spaces that qualify there. Rally would place a fort. No, there are no forts available anymore. Or a D6 is greater than the underground militia on the map. Well, there are 2 underground militia on the map, so they had to roll on that, and they rolled a 1. So the answer is no. Rabble rousing can shift 1 or more spaces toward active opposition. Yeah, that is true. They could shift Pennsylvania, because they have control there, or they could shift New York, because they have control there. The other spaces where they have control are already at active opposition, and there aren't any underground militia anywhere on the map to do a sort of sneaky rabble rousing. Okay, but there are 2 spaces, Pennsylvania and New York. Okay, so let's see. In each space where rabble rousing can shift toward active opposition, first in active support within that first and highest population. Well, neither of those are at active support, and they're both the same population. So they're going to choose between those 2 randomly. They rolled a 2-3, which gives Savannah. So following that around, we get to New York City first, before Pennsylvania. Okay, so they're going to use rabble rousing in New York City. Put that at passive opposition, place propaganda, and that will give them 2 more to do total opposition. Because this is a limited command, that's all they'll get to do this turn. The next card is Patriots Massacre Lenape Indians, and the British are first eligible. The event says Gnadenhutten Massacre. Remove 1 piece in Pennsylvania, remain eligible. Well, the British are not going to take that. Their event or command box, we see only the last bullet point came into play. British control 5 or more cities. Yes, they do. The event is effective. Yes, but barely. There's only 1 piece in Pennsylvania, that continental. So it would remove that. And a roll D6 is 5 or better. Well, they rolled a 3. So the answer there is no. Okay, so they'll carry on with their flow chart. British resources are greater than 0. They're at 10. 10 or more British regulars on the map. No, actually, there are only 2. Yeah, there are only 2 British regulars on the map right now. So the answer to that is no. Available British regulars greater than a D6. Yeah, so many available British regulars. Okay, so yes, they're going to muster. So place regulars first in neutral or passive. Within that first to add British control. Then where Tories are the only British units, then elsewhere, within each first and highest population. So what that comes down to is they want to choose a neutral or passive space where they would add British control with their 6 regulars, and they want to prioritize the highest population. Well, that means there are 3 possible spaces. New York City, that's neutral or passive. Putting in 6 regulars would give them control, and it's a 2 population space. Pennsylvania, that's neutral or passive. Putting in 6 regulars would give them control, and it's a 2 population space. And Maryland, Delaware, similarly. All the other spaces, either putting in those regulars would not give control, or it's not at neutral or passive, or it's not a 2 population space. Okay, so those are the 3 possibilities: New York City, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, Delaware. So they rolled on that, and they rolled a 5-1, which is right on the nose, New York City. So British bot is going to muster to place 6 regulars in New York City. So they paid 1 resource to muster in New York City, and they've taken control of that space once again. So moving on to the next bullet point, then place Tories first where regulars are the only British cubes. Within that, first where regulars were just placed. Okay, so let's take care of that part first. So regulars are the only British cubes in New York City, of course, and that's also true in Quebec City. There's only 1 regular there. But we have to be a little careful because there's a blockade in Quebec City, and muster is restricted with blockades. But if we look carefully here, it says muster, location, regulars in any one city that is not blockaded or an adjacent colony or the West Indies. Okay, so regulars are restricted from being placed in a blockaded city. But Tories are not. It says Tories in any city or colonies, not the West Indies, containing or adjacent to regulars or forts not at active opposition. So Tories can be placed in a blockaded city, so long as there are regulars there, or regulars or forts there, or regulars or forts adjacent to that space. Okay, and there's a regular there, so they can place Tories there. Therefore, British bot will spend 2 resources. No, sorry. They already paid for New York City, so they don't have to pay for that again. They'll place 2 Tories there for free, since they already paid for it. And they'll pay another resource to place 2 Tories in Quebec City. The next priority is to place Tories to change most control. Okay, and remember that Tories can be placed in any cities or colonies containing or adjacent to regulars or forts, not at active opposition. Okay, well, there's a couple of spaces they could choose here to change control that are adjacent to British regulars or forts. Okay, Pennsylvania is one option. It's adjacent to Philadelphia, which has a regular. Maryland, Delaware is another option. It's adjacent also to Philadelphia. Putting 2 Tories in either of those spaces would change control. New Jersey is an option. It's adjacent to 2 cities with regulars. And right now it's uncontrolled because there are only Indians there. So putting 2 Tories there would make that British controlled. And I think that's it. Okay. New Hampshire, placing 2 Tories there would not give them control, even though it is adjacent to Quebec City. And there are no other spaces on the map. Well, that's not true. Georgia down here, placing Tories there would give them control of Georgia. And North Carolina, too. That's adjacent to a fort. So that's also a possibility. Okay, so there's actually lots of possibilities, really. Okay, so they're going to have to choose randomly, and we'll see What I'll do is I'll just roll and then just go down the chart and check each one and see if it's a possible space. Oh, but we do want to change the most control. Okay, so they're going to want to choose a 2 population space first if possible. Okay, so I'll keep that in mind when we do this random roll. The roll is a 3-1. And that gives New Hampshire first. But of course, placing 2 Tories there, even though it's possible, would not give them control. And it's only 1 population space, so moving on. Connecticut, Rhode Island, they already have control of Connecticut, Rhode Island. New York City, they already have control of New York City. New Jersey, well, they could put 2 Tories in New Jersey and take control of it, but that's only a 1 population space. And they want to prioritize 2 population spaces, so moving on. Northwest, well, they could place 2 Tories there and take control, but they can't. You can't muster with Tories in an Indian Reserve province because it says Tories in any cities or colonies. Okay, so that's out. All right, so Maryland, Delaware, that's their choice. That's a 2 population space. It's adjacent to Philadelphia, and placing 2 Tories there would give them control. So there you go. Maryland, Delaware is the next priority. They'll put 2 Tories in there and pay a resource for it. They've only chosen 3 spaces so far for muster, and British bot has a maximum of 4 spaces for muster. So we carry on. Well, they're still trying to change most control. They're still within that priority. So they rolled again. This time a 4-2, and again, we'll just go down the line until we find an appropriate space. So 4-2 is Norfolk. Okay, well, they could take control of Norfolk, but that's a 1 population space, and there are definitely some 2 population spaces still available, so they won't choose that one. Southwest, again, Indian Reserve provinces can't be selected for this. Virginia, well, that is a 2 population space that they could take control of, but it's at active opposition, and you cannot muster with Tories at active opposition. So that's no good. Okay, Charlestown, they already control Charlestown. North Carolina. Okay, well, they don't control North Carolina. It's not at active opposition, and it is adjacent to a fort. So they can place Tories there. So they'll choose North Carolina, they'll place 2 Tories there and take control of that space and pay 1 resource for it. So that is now the maximum number of spaces that British bot will select for muster. But let's see if they will do any reward loyalty or put in a fort. The 3rd bullet point says, then in 1 space, first one already selected above, if opposition is greater than support plus a D3, well, it isn't. Support is still 6 higher than opposition, which is quite a bit lower than it has been most of the game, but that's still more than a D3 distance away. Or no British forts available. Well, there is a British fort available. There's 1. So they're not going to reward loyalty. Excuse me. If no reward loyalty, place fort in a colony with 5 or more British cubes and no British fort. Well, they can't select any more spaces here because they're already maxed out. So it's got to be one of these 4 spaces they've already selected. And 2 of them are cities. And they want to put a fort in a colony, right? It's not great for the British to put a fort in a city, even though they could put one in New York right now. They have one in Boston, but they started with that one. The reason is because the British are in supply whenever they're in a city with just control. They don't need a fort in the city in order to be in supply in a city. But in order to be in supply while in a colony, they need a fort there. So it's better for them to have their forts in the colonies than it is to have them in the cities. Okay, so that's why, presumably that's why British bot prioritizes colonies here for putting in forts. All right, so only Maryland, Delaware, or North Carolina are possibilities, and neither of those have enough cubes to put in a fort. So British bot is neither going to reward loyalty nor place a fort this turn. British bot would now like to use a special activity. They'd like to skirmish, but they're not able to. Skirmish requires a space or West Indies with British regulars and rebellion pieces, and no battle garrison or muster in the space. Well, the only space that has British regulars and rebellion pieces is New York City. But they did muster in that space this turn. So they can't just, muster there and skirmish in the same turn. So they can't skirmish. That can't happen. So they're going to use naval pressure instead. But we do have to remember that before the British use their special activity, Howe has his capability that comes into effect first. Right? So for Howe, before executing a British special activity, first lower F and I one level. So before they'd use naval pressure, F and I will go down one level, which means that blockade from Quebec City will be returned to the West Indies. Now, since F and I is at 0, naval pressure simply allows the British to add 1d3 resources. They rolled on that and they rolled a 1. So the British gain 1 resource, and that is the end of their turn. The French are next eligible, and they can take the event or a limited command. The event once again says remove 1 piece in Pennsylvania and remain eligible. Well, the only piece in Pennsylvania is still that Continental there. And surely the French would not be interested in removing that. But, if you just look at the event or command box, it's possible that they might. The last bullet point there, if the Treaty of Alliance has been played, the event's effective, and a roll of d6 is 5 or higher, that could actually be answered in the affirmative. But if we go to the rules, 8.3.3, ineffective events. If an event, after an event instructions are taken into account, would have no effect at all, not even manipulating eligibility, or where the only effect would be to remove 1 or more friendly pieces without replacing them with other friendly pieces, or the event shifts the difference between support and opposition in favor of the enemy side, a non-player faction will consider it to be ineffective and choose a command and special activity instead. Okay, well, that's kind of interesting here because this event doesn't just remove that friendly piece in Pennsylvania. There's also this other bit, remain eligible. So it actually does another thing. So how do we interpret this? Do we understand this to be a totally ineffective event that the French won't play at all, won't even consider playing? Or do we consider it to be an effective event, in which case, they got to take their chances on that roll of a d6? Now, it's not completely ridiculous for the French to take this event, because the next card up, the French are first eligible. So, you might think, well, maybe the French are thinking here, if they were a human player and did this, we might think, well, that's not a completely absurd thing to do because they get to be first eligible on the next card. They get to remain eligible. So even if it won't do anything as far as removing any pieces from Pennsylvania, they'll still be eligible. But the thing is, if that's their thinking, then passing would be the obvious thing to do, not take the event. Because if you pass, you remain eligible and you get 2 resources. So this is a very absurd thing to do, to take this event. It won't do anything in Pennsylvania, and all that happens is the French remain eligible. Passing would be the much better play if that were the case. This would be a dumb play for a human player. But look, we're playing Nullitaire, and I'm trying to play these bots the way they're written as literally as possible. So I think we've got to make a roll on that. We've got to see if that d6 roll is 5 or higher. If it is, then they've got to take this event, because we're playing these bots as written, as literally as possible. And so even if that means that they make suboptimal or even downright absurd plays. So we're going to roll on that, and we'll see what happens. Oh, boy. Well, The roll is a 5. So FrenchBot does a pretty absurd thing here. The Treaty of Alliance has been played. This event is effective. It at least affects eligibility. And the D6 roll is a 5 or higher. So they're going to take the event, which means they simply get to remain eligible because they don't want to actually remove that piece from Pennsylvania. So they'll ignore the first part of this event and simply do the second part, remain eligible. Except that's not quite right. I got to thinking about that, and the event doesn't say you may remove a piece or anything like that. It just says remove one piece in Pennsylvania. And so I went to the rules on this, and here at 5.1.3, an executed event's text that can be implemented must be, if not all of its text can be carried out, implement that which can. So it turns out the French can't just ignore a part of the event that they don't like. They actually do have to do that. They will. They'll remove that piece from Pennsylvania, and which will remove control, rebellion control. Okay. There we go. They get to remain eligible, though. So that's something. On to the next card. On second thought, I'm going to end this video here. We got through 5 cards, which is a good amount for one video, I think. So I'm going to stop here for this session. As usual, if you like this video, please consider giving it a like, subscribe to the channel if you're so inclined, and I'll see you next time.